Hello children. So today in this module we are going to read the chapter The Portrait of a Lady, book Hornbill, written by Khushwant Singh. Now children, Khushwant Singh, he is quite a celebrated author of India and he is widely read on international level. Now this chapter, The Portrait of a Lady, is basically tracing the phases of a grandson's relationship with his grandmother while growing up. Here, the narrator explores the theme of innocence, friendship, love, kindness, selflessness, respect, and acceptance. It is a piece of memory, actually, that the grandson recalls after his grandmother's death. The story is narrated in the first person, drawing the portrait of an old lady in the mind of the readers. The description is so vivid that when you read the story, there is an image of grandmother created in our mind. Now, let's start with the paragraphs and the explanations. Now, the first paragraph, it says, my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. My grandmother's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. Let's check the glossary, children. Here I found just one word difficult here, mantelpiece. The meaning of the word is a structure of wood, marble or stone above and around a fireplace. Now let's come to the explanation part. See children, the background of or the setting of the story is Indian, and like we earlier discussed that the story is tracing the relationship between grandson and his grandmother. So you can relate with this story, and due to the setting being Indian, it is not that difficult for you to understand it. Okay. So now here, if you read the first paragraph, you find out that the narrator is telling us how his grandmother was, and he says that he had known her for past 20 years, and since the beginning she had always been old and wrinkled. When he says that for past 20 years means since he was born, since he recognized her, okay, since he was able to recognize her, he had seen her in the same condition, in the same appearance, old and wrinkled. And that is why what happened, it was difficult for the narrator to believe that she was once young and pretty, though many people told him that the grandmother was once young and pretty. Now then it says that, his grandfather, okay, people also told him that his grandmother had a husband, okay, but it was difficult for the grandson to believe it. Okay, though he had seen his grandfather's portrait there hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room, and when he looks at the portrait, he again feels that grandfather was looking equally old, and he looked so old that it seemed that he had always been, the same, and he can't imagine his grandfather also ever young, or ever he can't imagine he had ever had any wife or he could have children. He feels that in the portrait he looked so old, as if he was 100 years old, okay, and he feels that such a person of that age could never have a wife or children. They could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So here you can see this basically reflects the innocence of this grandson. Now children, let's come to the next paragraph. The next paragraph says, as for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Let's check the glossary. So children, you can see here that the words which I feel are difficult for you to understand, I have those are written in yellow, okay, and the meaning of those words are given here. Revolting, the meaning of revolting is extremely unpleasant or disgusting. Absurd is illogical. Undignified, meaning disrespectful. Fables, fictitious stories with a moral teaching. Prophets, saints. Now come to the explanation part. So here the narrator tells us that my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. Okay, so he feels that he can't imagine his grandmother ever being young and pretty. That was quite an unpleasant thought or imagination which he never liked to. He never liked that idea. Okay, and though he says that his grandmother always shared with him that how she used to play, like those games which children play when they are young. Okay, but he also feels that at this age, because he had never seen his grandmother except old and wrinkled or bent. Okay, he had never seen her otherwise, so it was difficult for him to imagine her doing anything else except what she was doing since he had known her. Okay, so that is why he says that he found it quite undignified and absurd or illogical, imagining his grandmother playing those games what children play when they are young. Okay, and so what he did, he treated these stories of his grandmother or those experiences or those memories that his grandmother shared with him, he treated it like the fables or like the stories told by the prophets or by the saints, which people just believe for the sake of believing, but they actually don't believe that. Now the next paragraph, children, says, she had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles, running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as he had known her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Let's take glossary here, children. Crisscross, it is basically referring to wrinkles, a pattern of intersecting straight lines. Hobbled, walked in an awkward way. Awkward way, why? Old people, they are not able to walk properly. They limp at times, or they have problem or they have difficulty in walking. So she used to hobble. Stoop, bent. The grandmother was bent. Her posture was bent. Locks, hair. Rosary, a string of beads for chanting prayer. Untidily, not neat. Serenity, peaceful and calm. Puckered, a face contract into wrinkles. Inaudible, not audible or unable to be heard. Contentment, a state of satisfaction. Let's check explanation here, children. Now the author says he is basically giving the physical description of his grandmother, which is so vivid and clear that it draws an image of the old lady in everybody's mind. When you read this paragraph, you must have created an image of the grandmother, the narrator's grandmother in your mind. So now he explains how his grandmother was short, fat, slightly bent in posture due to age, and her face was also covered with wrinkles. Okay, and when he says that crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere, so he actually wants to emphasize in this point that she looked so old that even aging was no more visible on her face. Okay, and she had been the same, and now he was sure that because he had since the beginning he had seen her in the same way, so he was now certain that grandmother was never young and pretty, and she had been the same, as old as she was then. And according to the narrator, she was beautiful but not pretty. So children, you can understand here the two words beautiful and pretty, it is being used for age. Pretty is normally we use pretty word for girls, okay, and beautiful is used for women. Okay, so here these two words are referring to age basically. So grandson is ready to accept that the grandmother was beautiful, but pretty, he doesn't feel that she was ever pretty because he can't imagine her ever being young. She walked around the house in an awkward way, wearing spotless white sari with beads of rosary holding in one hand and the other hand rested on her back, supporting her bent. Her white locks of hair were spread on her face. She was constantly chanting prayers. Here what happens, the narrator, he compares his grandmother to winter landscape in the mountains, which has a peaceful and calm feel, and he says that she was a living example of purity, serenity, peace and contentment, because he could see all that on the face of that old lady or on the face of his grandmother. The next paragraph, children, says, my grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing-song while she bathed and dressed me, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. After a breakfast of thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. See, it's such a beautiful description, okay, what a beautiful relationship they share that is being discussed here. Now let's check the meaning, children. Monotonous, dull and boring. Fetch, go for and then bring back something for someone. Plastered, covered with a layer of plaster. Earthen, made of clay. Stale, something which is not fresh. Explanation, children. The author in this paragraph, he gives an account of, it is basically a beautiful account of his life or his relationship with his grandmother when he was there in the village. He also gives us the reason that why he was left there in the village with his grandmother and where exactly his parents were. So his parents, they went to the city, and until they settled down, till then the narrator or the grandson was left here with his grandmother, living with her in the village. So they both were each other's companion there in the village. So now they were sharing a very beautiful bond there. The author's grandmother, she every morning used to wake him up and get him ready for school. She would recite her morning prayers while she bathed and dressed him up, and she used to recite it because she wanted the narrator to learn it, the grandson to learn it. But grandson, he listened to his grandmother not because he wanted to learn it, but he actually loved her voice. Okay, so what happens, she would make his things ready. Grandmother would prepare everything, get everything ready for the grandson, whether it was his wooden slate, tiny earthen ink pot, a red pen, and then she would feed him, she would give him stale chapatis, butter and sugar spread on it to eat in breakfast, and after that she used to accompany him to school, and she also used to carry some stale chapatis with her to feed the village dogs. In the next paragraph, the narrator says, my grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for the chapatis we threw to them. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, my grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of her city house. Now, glossary, children. Scriptures, the sacred writings of a religion or sacred books of a particular religion. Growling, making a low guttural sound in the throat, which those dogs used to make when they used to fight. Now, explanation. The narrator tells us how his grandmother would accompany him to the school, as the temple was attached to the school and she used to visit the temple daily. So narrator tells us that how when on one side he would sit with other children on the veranda and would learn the alphabet and prayers in the chorus, and the teacher was this temple priest who used to teach them. The grandmother by the time used to sit inside the temple and she would read the scriptures or she would offer her prayers there. Thus grandmother every day used to accompany the grandson to the school because the school was attached to the temple. After finishing, they both would walk back together to their home, and now on the way to their home, grandmother would feed stray dogs with those stale chapatis that she used to carry with her every morning. Okay, and these stray dogs growling and fighting with each other for those chapatis, they would follow them to their home. Now eventually, when the parents of the grandson they got settled in the city, they called the grandmother and the grandson or the narrator both there in the city. Now children, what happens? There comes a turning point in their relationship, in the relationship of narrator and grandmother when they shifted to city. Okay. So what was the turning point? Because they in the village they were sharing a very strong and a very beautiful bond. They were each other's companion there. Okay. But now when they moved to city, how their life changed. Let's see that. Though they shared the same room, but she no longer would accompany him to school as the grandson started going to an English medium school and the motor bus would come to pick and drop him. There were no dogs in the streets whom the grandmother could feed, so she started feeding sparrows in the veranda of their house. Now children, these changes do not stop here only, rather there are more changes that take place with the passage of time. We'll read that in the next paragraph. So let's move to the next paragraph. The next paragraph says, as the years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning. The law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the word being round, etc. This made her unhappy. She would not help me with my lessons. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. One day, I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations. It was the monopoly of harlots and beggars, and not meant for gentlefolk. She said nothing, but her silence meant disapproval. She rarely talked to me after that. You can see here, children, what changes took place in the relationship or in that beautiful bond of a grandson and grandmother once they moved to the city. First, we will check the glossary and then we will come to the explanation part. Lewd means indecent or obscene. Monopoly, something that is controlled by one person or a group and not shared by others. Harlots, prostitutes. Gentlefolk, people belonging to gentle families or noble birth. Explanation. Now the narrator, he tells us that with the passage of time, the years passed by, his interaction with his grandmother, it reduced. For some time, though in the beginning for some time, grandmother continued to wake him up and she would also get him ready for school. Okay, and when grandson would come back from the school, obviously she was not able to accompany him to school because he was taking the school bus. Okay, so when grandson would come back from the school, she would ask him what he learnt there in the school that day, and the grandson would tell her the English words or the scientific terms or Archimedes' principle or word being round, which she did not know about. Okay, so what happened now, she could not help her grandson with his lessons. Fine. And besides, she was also unhappy with the school, as in his new school she found that the school never taught about God and religious scriptures. and this made her sad. She did not approve of such an education, because for as per her, according to her, education of God or scriptures, it was more important. When there was a sudden change in grandmother, or grandmother even stopped talking to the grandson. One day when she got to know that grandson had he was getting music lessons in the school, and she became very disturbed then. According to grandmother, music was indecent, and it was not meant for the people who belong to gentle families. Rather, it was meant for the beggars and prostitutes. So she did not like that the grandson learned music. So she finally stopped talking to grandson, because she knew that she was hurt every time, or she was sad every time she would ask the grandson what was taught there in the school. The next paragraph says, when I went up to university, I was given a room of my own. The common link of friendship was snapped. My grandmother accepted her seclusion with resignation. She rarely left her spinning wheel to talk to anyone. From sunrise to sunset, she sat by her wheel spinning and reciting prayers. Only in the afternoon she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. While she sat in the veranda, breaking the bread into little bits, hundreds of little birds collected round her, creating a veritable bedlam of chirping. Some came and perched on her legs, others on her shoulders, some even sat on her head. She smiled, but never shooed them away. It used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. Let's check glossary, children. Snapped, break suddenly and completely. Seclusion, the state of being private and away from the people. Resignation, the acceptance of something undesirable but inevitable. Spinning wheel, a household machine with a wheel attached to it for spinning yarn. Veritable, interesting or unusual. Bedlam, confusion, perched, alight or rest on something. Should, make a person or animal go away. Explanation. Now children, there comes a phase in the relationship of grandson and grandmother when grandson, he started going to university and he was given a separate room. Now what was the common link between them? That room only. Now once the grandson was given a separate room, that common link between them also was taken away. So what happened? That now their relationship was sort of broken. Okay. The grandmother accepted her loneliness. She accepted her seclusion, because that is what happens, when parents, they grow old, children become adult, they are mature, they move away, they have their own world, they want to live in their own world, and there is less interaction between the old people and the younger generation. So that is what happened here, and this is something inevitable. Generation gap is inevitable. It is unavoidable. Nobody can avoid this. It is better to accept it instead of fighting. Okay. So what happened? Grandmother was quite understanding. So what she did, she accepted her seclusion, because she knew that children, they move away when they grow up. And now what happened? She became more private and started spending her whole day spinning wheel. From sunrise to sunset, she would not talk to anybody. She would sit silently reciting her prayers and spinning her wheel. In the afternoon, she would feed sparrows in the veranda. Breaking the bread into small pieces, she would feed hundreds of birds. Those sparrows would gather around her. Some would sit near her, some on her legs, some on her shoulders, and few even on her head. She never shooed them away, but always smiled, because that was her happiest hour of the day. Thus, grandmother engaged herself in different ways. So children, the explanation part is over. I am stopping it here. The next the part which is left, we will be discussing that in the next module, which I will be uploading later. Let's have a small recap of what you have read today. Okay. So here it says the narrator gives us a detailed account of his grandmother with whom he had a long association. He describes his grandmother as short, fat, and slightly bent. Her silver hair was scattered untidily on her wrinkled face. She hobbled around the house in white clothes, with one hand her waist supporting the bent and the other telling the beads of her rosary. The narrator recollects her as not very pretty but always beautiful. He compares her serene face to that of a winter landscape. During their long stay in the village, grandmother would wake him up in the morning, plastered his wooden slate, prepared his breakfast, and escorted him to school. While he studied alphabet, she read the scriptures in the temple attached to the school. On their way back home, she fed stale chapatis to stray dogs. The turning point in their relationship came when they went to live in the city. Now, the author went to a city school in a motor bus and studied English, law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, and many more things which he could not understand at all. Grandmother could no longer accompany him to school nor help the grandson in his studies. She was upset that there was no teaching of God and scriptures at city school. Instead, he was given music lesson, which according to her was not meant for gentlefolk, but for harlots and beggars, though the grandmother did not approve it but kept quiet. When Khushwant Singh went to university, he was given a separate room. The common link of their friendship was snapped. Grandmother rarely talked to anyone now. She spent most of her time sitting beside her spinning wheel, reciting prayers and feeding the sparrows in the afternoon. Now children, here is this vocabulary practice for you, as I was giving you the meaning of the difficult words along with the paragraphs. Okay, so here you can see this and you practice it. Okay, the words are given on the left hand side and the options are given on the right hand side. You have to choose the correct option. Now comes the assignment part, children. The questions given here, you have to write these questions in your notebook and write the answers on the basis of the part that you have read today. In case of any queries, please send me your queries. I will be addressing that in the next module. Thank you. Stay safe, stay sanitized and stay indoors.